In October of 1941, retired Denver Railroad employee Phillip Peters was at home alone. His wife Helen had broken her hip in a bad fall and was recovering at the hospital. The two had been married for over 40 years, so adjusting to life without his wife was a bit of a struggle for Phillip. His eating schedule became somewhat irregular. On October 17th, he made a trip to the icebox for a pre-dinner snack. To his shock, another man was already standing at the icebox. A tall, gaunt man whose body odor was an assault on the senses. The two had met before, but only the gaunt man remembered. This week on Out of the Past, the Peters family and the Denver Spiderman, Theodore Kony's. Within an hour, people began to worry about Mr. Peters. Friends in the Denver neighborhood where the couple resided had been taking care of Phillip while Helen was in the hospital. Neighbors would come over to clean and help with other chores, and households took turns inviting Phillip to breakfast and dinner. Friends jumped on the opportunity to help the Peters family, as they were popular in the community. They had been upstanding citizens of Denver for over 40 years and had raised a son to adulthood in that home. Phillip Peters was a mandolin player and had built many relationships in the local Denver Musicians Club, where he played and discussed guitar and mandolin with other aficionados. Phillip Peters was always punctual. That's why the Ross family immediately went over to Phillip's house to check on him when he didn't arrive for dinner on time. As she crossed the street, Mrs. Ross noticed that all the lights were off in the Peters' home. She knocked, but got no response. She attempted to enter, but all the doors and windows were locked. After finally climbing a fence and gaining access to the house through the back, Mrs. Ross received the shock of her life. It was like a horror movie. There was blood everywhere, especially on the floor. A big streak of it ran from one end of the room to the other, and when Mrs. Ross got to the end of that streak, she found the lifeless body of Phillip Peters. The Denver police found something extraordinarily strange about the crime scene. There was no point of entry. All of the doors and windows had been locked from the inside. A murder had clearly happened, but not much evidence was left to determine how. They searched extensively to make sure that the perpetrator wasn't hiding anywhere, but couldn't find anything. Like the interior of the house, Phillip Peters' body was covered in blood. There were defensive wounds on his forearms, suggesting that he fought back. Police were able to determine that he had been beaten 37 times with a cast-iron stove shaker. But it had been thoroughly cleaned by the time they inspected it. The police were baffled. Figuring out the motive was one of the greatest challenges. It didn't appear to be a robbery, as there was cash lying around that hadn't been touched. Did the Peters family have any enemies? Any secrets that their neighbors didn't know about? No one could think of anyone who had anything against this family. Police followed a couple of leads. They questioned a few people, but they suspected these people for strange reasons. One man was questioned because he was wearing a coat that he looked too poor to afford. They could not tie the coat to Mr. Peters, and this leg of the investigation fizzled out. They followed a few more leads, but nothing was promising. After healing from her injury, Helen Peters returned to her home. She was now a widow and had the big, empty house to herself. Rather than living in the family home on her own, where no one would be able to help her if she had another fall, she invited 2 nurses to care for her, Edith Clark and Hattie Johnson. It took time for Helen to adjust to this new life, but once she had, she and her nurses began noticing strange sounds around the house. Groceries were constantly going missing. Only a bit would vanish at a time, but eventually, Helen and her nurses began to notice. Helen also reported hearing strange sounds coming from the basement, and belongings moving from the places she'd placed them. So Helen jumped to the conclusion that people were pushing her towards. She was living in a haunted house. She was the last to come to the conclusion. Her nurses had been certain for weeks. Helen's nurses installed a bell by her bed that she could press to notify neighbors if she was in trouble. One evening, a neighbor heard it and came running over in a cold sweat. What had happened? Was Helen in trouble? No. She was down enjoying her evening in the living room. It would have been physically impossible for her to have pressed the bell. The event was attributed to ghosts, of course. Even with the extra hired help, accidents couldn't be completely prevented. Unfortunately, just a few weeks after returning to her home, Helen suffered from another fall, breaking her opposite hip. So back to the hospital she moved. Luckily, she was able to heal quickly and again return home in April. Neighbors frequently reported seeing a tall, thin male figure wandering the house. Some who were consistently watching even noticed the blinds moving up and down or the curtains opening and closing. It was nightmare fuel for the community, but Helen moved back in. Helen's nurse, Edith Clark, heard an unusual tapping one day and went to check where it was coming from. She nearly had a heart attack when she encountered a slim, dark figure in the stairway. She saw a frail white hand pull the door shut, then heard footsteps running away from her. She called the authorities immediately, but they found nothing. They searched the entire home. There was a panel in the ceiling that led to a small attic, but the authorities agreed that the opening was too small for any adult person to slide through. They also couldn't get the panel to budge. It was like it had been glued down. The stairwell sliding was the last straw. After that, it became too much for everyone living in the house. Terrified, Edith Clark was the first to quit. After repeatedly hearing unexplained footsteps in the house, Hattie quit shortly afterward. In June, at the request of her son, Phillip Jr., Helen fled from Denver to Grand Junction, where he and his family had settled. After she moved in, she was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Back in Denver, the house continued to be an object of fascination. Children reported seeing lights on in the uninhabited house. Knowing full well nobody was inside, the kids assumed they were seeing the ghostly figures of spirits passing by windows. People even began to speculate that Phillip himself had been murdered by the ghost haunting his house. In fact, the crime became known popularly as the Denver ghost slaying. The house was a popular topic of gossip around Denver, so police continued to monitor the property. Officers Bill Jackson and Roy Bluxham were stationed outside the house, and soon they saw their fair share of suspicious activity. The utilities had been shut off after Helen left, so if anyone was in there, they had no access to running water, heat, gas, or electricity. Nobody could survive a Denver winter without those amenities. But soon enough, those officers began to see the same figure moving about inside. They entered the home with their weapons drawn, but they couldn't find anyone in there. A loud noise from upstairs spooked both officers, and they ran to see if they could catch what caused it. Upstairs, they spotted a pair of legs dangling out from the entrance to the same attic they thought was inaccessible. They each grabbed a leg and pulled their suspect to the ground. There had never been a ghost at all. The terrifying figure that everyone kept encountering was simply a squatter. The man was barely recognizable as human. He was clothed, but only a few threads held the garments together. He was armed, but didn't attempt to fire on police. The man was 5 feet 11 inches tall and only weighed 75 pounds. It was obvious that it had been years since he'd bathed. His skin was described as being the color of a mushroom. Police searched the tiny attic where this man had built what authorities could only call a nest. The odor was indescribable, more vile than anything they'd ever smelled in their lives. The walls were lined with human waste. The man's distinct coloring and smell, along with his horrifying living quarters, earned him the nickname, the Spiderman of Denver. The man they captured was Theodore Edward Kony, and he'd been living in that attic for 10 months. He was living there when Helen and Phillip lived together, and he suffered through the period of time before Mrs. Peters moved home from the hospital, nearly freezing to death without any heating system. He was there with Helen and her nurses, and he was still living there months after they left. Phillip Peters had been murdered by a man living in his own home. Kony's was relatively straightforward with the police. He cooperated and explained how he was able to survive and go largely unnoticed for long periods of time. He told them that while the family didn't know he was living there, he and Phillip Peters were not strangers when he moved into the attic. Kony's had been a sickly child. It was a surprise to everyone that he was able to survive the tuberculosis he contracted at a very young age. The doctors told his mother that it was unlikely he'd live to adulthood. So she did everything she could to keep him safe. He had dreams of playing big league sports, but she forbade it. Instead, she pushed him into the arts, specifically music. He learned to play the mandolin and excelled. A number of articles treat Mrs. Kony's decision to push her son into music as abusive for some reason. They paint a picture of a sad boy locked inside a room with a musical instrument while he stared longingly out the window at the other boys playing football while his mother yelled at him to practice. I find that pretty strange. Sure, he wasn't fulfilling a particular sports fantasy, but it might have killed him had his mother allowed him to play these sports. Kony's got a lot of enjoyment through playing music, and I don't think it was something that made his childhood miserable. I have a master's in music education, so maybe I'm biased. I think it's pretty ridiculous to act like this abuse of sports deprivation and enforced music playing was part of the reason he became a murderer. He may have wished he was on the football team in high school, but so do a lot of other people who don't go on to murder people. Additionally, Kony's enjoyed music. He continued to play it into his adulthood. That's actually how he met Phillip Peters. He was part of the guitar and mandolin society that Peters worked with. Kony spent his early childhood in Illinois, but after his father passed away, his mother used the insurance payout to move herself and her son to Denver. Unfortunately, a series of tragedies struck the family during the early aughts. Kony's mother lost all her money to a con artist and passed away soon afterward, leaving him an orphan at the age of 18. The Peters family helped Kony's. They could see that he was struggling with the death of his mother, and they invited him to dinner and gave him handouts to help him get back on his feet. They were his saviors, and he would not soon forget it. Once he was feeling confident, Kony's left Colorado to make it on his own. But after several failed business ventures, he ended up a transient, living on freight trains until his return to Denver 30 years later. He figured the Peterses would help him out just as they had before. Unfortunately, in the late summer of 1941, Phillip Peters did not recognize Theodore Kony when he showed up on his doorstep asking for aid. Peters sent him away, not wanting to interact with a strange, possibly intoxicated man who showed up on his doorstep asking for money. This devastated Kony. It angered him greatly. How could they have forgotten him? They were his saviors. So, he only pretended to leave the property. He hung around for a while, trying to find a way to slip inside. He soon discovered that the back door was unlocked. He searched the house, looking behind doors and in cabinets. Upstairs, he found an opening to the attic, covered by a tiny panel. The attic itself was only around the size of a coffin and was originally made for storage. It's difficult to imagine someone actually living in that space, but for Theodore Edward Kony, it was perfect. He learned the Peters' schedules quickly. They led a predictable life, and Kony knew when it would be safe to head to the kitchen for a snack or to hang out in the parlor and listen to the radio. In fact, the Peterses were so predictable that Kony claimed he actually got bored and tried to make his own fun, haunting the household. He would follow Phillip around, getting as close to him as possible before Phillip would turn his head and Kony's would hide. He listened to each and every conversation the couple had. Sometimes he would sneak into their bathroom and shave his face with Phillip's razor. Unbeknownst to the Peters family, they literally had no privacy. When Helen broke her hip, their schedule changed up a bit, so Kony's had to be on his toes. On that fateful afternoon in October, Phillip deviated from his usual schedule. Kony's, thinking that Phillip was visiting Helen in the hospital, came down to the icebox for a snack. But Phillip wasn't visiting Helen. He had fallen asleep and taken an accidental nap. When he woke, he headed to the icebox. The last thing he would ever do. Everything would have been all right and Phil Peters would have been alive today if he hadn't caught me robbing the icebox. It was him or me, Kony's told the authorities. After the murder, Kony's remained in the house. It was difficult to survive because Mrs. Peters didn't pay for utilities when she wasn't living there. And there was a long period of time when she wasn't. He didn't have access to water, heat, electricity, and almost died several times. It was miserable hot in the summer, and my feet froze in the dead of winter in that attic, but it was all part of the price I was willing to pay. I can't tell you why I stuck it out. I guess it was mostly because it was a world all my own, Kony said. Kony's told law enforcement that they had indeed found the correct door to his nest back when the nurse called about the sighting. But the panel wouldn't move because Kony's was sitting on it. He had used his entire body weight to keep it closed. The media went crazy for the story. The ghost slayings of Denver had been no ghost at all. It was a murderer living in the victim's house. When people caught a glimpse of him, they were horrified. He barely resembled a human being. Theodore Edward Kony's faced trial for first-degree murder in October of 1942, a full year after the crime. Foster Klein, a court-appointed attorney for Kony's, argued that the murder had not been premeditated, and that a first-degree charge was unwarranted. He didn't dispute his client's guilt, but instead made sure the court understood the special circumstances of the case and Kony's mental state at the time. Kony's had been evaluated in prison and deemed fit for trial, but his attorney was unhappy with this and requested that he undergo an additional psychological evaluation to assess his mental state. This was necessary if they wanted to avoid the death penalty. The second evaluation indicated that Kony's was indeed fit and in his right mind. A plea of not guilty by reason of insanity was not going to work in this situation. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes on Halloween of 1942. Theodore Edward Kony's was found guilty and sentenced to life at the Colorado State Penitentiary. He was not upset at all. In fact, he was thrilled. Upon the reading of the verdict, he told his attorney, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." This is a heartbreaking statement. Prison was going to be a release for Kony's. He would have a bed and 3 square meals a day, something that seemed like a luxury for homeless people coming out of the Great Depression. Sadly, the situation today isn't all that different. In many countries, not just the US, people commit crimes so they won't have to worry about affording retirement. A safe place to sleep and proper nutrition are human rights, not luxuries. People should not see prison as a better alternative to life outside, but for many, it is. We need to change that. This is an insane case. The murderer was living in the house all along. He was there when the Peterses had their private time. He was there when Helen broke her hip. He was there to murder Phillip and continued living there for months afterward. He enjoyed scaring the residents and playing tricks on people he was spying on, and that is horrifying. It makes me want to check every nook and cranny in my home right now. And you know what? This case is not unique. Things like this have happened time and time again. I'll bring you another similar story down the line. In the meantime, if you found this scary and are hungry for more, I definitely recommend the movie Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2019, and my goodness, did it deserve it. That's all for this week. Remember, staying home saves lives. Stay home, stay safe. Please give me a subscribe and a thumbs up. I'll see you next time on Out of the Past.